When people go missing in state parks and their bodies are found, we understand a terrible accident happened. Someone lost sight of the trail. They fell from a cliff or into a river by accident. They could have been attacked by a wild animal, or they may have even starved. But do you ever wonder what really happened to those poor, unfortunate souls who became lost in state parks, and no trace of them was ever found? I can't help but wonder who or what took them. Today's episode is about scary state park stories because some very creepy things are often seen in state parks. Now let's begin. I was born and raised in East Tennessee, but I'm the furthest thing from a country boy you'll ever meet. I've never nor will I ever have interest in hunting, fishing, big trucks, or wearing cowboy boots. I mean, no offense, but it just isn't my thing. Being raised in the area, I've heard my fair share of local urban legends, and frankly, I've never put an ounce of thought into them. Just seems like campfire stuff, in my opinion. My dad is from East Tennessee, but my mom is from Ohio. My dad got me started on mountain biking whenever I was pretty young, and it quickly became a bit of an addiction of mine. As anyone who lives in East Tennessee knows, we had an unseasonably warm winter, meaning that you could go biking much later in the season than you would usually be able to. On the second week of December, I was ready to go on a Saturday morning ride, but my dad being the supervisor over several large companies, and my sister frankly having no interest that day, I realized I was going to be flying solo, which wasn't really a big deal. I mean, it's not like it's the first time I've been biking by myself. I pulled up to the parking area of a local state park, and I was going to ride some of the bike/horse trails as opposed to going to my usual bike park called Windrock. It was a particularly gloomy day, and honestly a bit muddy, but I wasn't going to let it get in my way because I knew cold weather was coming and I wanted to get in one more ride before it got too cold. The state park, which usually has a lot of hikers and even horse riders, was particularly empty that day, so I found a bit of tranquility in that. The trails were certainly nothing too crazy, so I was just taking it easy for once. I began to notice some strange rustling sounds to the left of me, but I wasn't too concerned about it. After all, you always hear some kind of animal in the woods while you're riding, but this was quite a bit louder than that. But I understood there were bears in the area, so if anything, I was just on a bit of a higher guard. As I continued on my gloomy ride, the noises never did stop at any time. After a while, I pulled a bit off the trail to stand there and take a bit of a breather and to rehydrate. It was then that I saw something much taller than me, meaning it had to be well over 6 feet tall. It was covered in matted and wet black hair, facial features like nothing I've ever seen in my life, and it was breathing with a snarling growl at the back of its throat. Not knowing what in God's name I was looking at, I slowly slipped everything back into the pack that I had mounted under my seat, and as quickly as I could, I pedaled with all my might. No matter how fast or hard I rode, it kept up with little to no effort. I was quite literally convinced that it was eventually going to make a diving leap at my back, and that would be the end of me. However, after what seemed like over half an hour, I came out of the trail entrance and back into the parking area. I didn't even bother mounting my bike onto the back of my car. Rather, I opened up the trunk lid and just shoved it in, shutting my door and getting the heck out of there. I've recently purchased a road bike, as I no longer know if I'll ever go mountain biking again, at least not while I live in East Tennessee anyway. I've always called stories of cryptids and creatures in the woods nonsense, but take it from probably the biggest skeptic you've ever spoken to. These things are real, and you need to be careful. It always wears a mask, from blossoms and blazes. I live in New York State. I don't recall what age I was exactly when it began, but I do know it began with me waking suddenly in the night, only to be greeted by a large, solid black figure. No features were visible, just a silhouette. I tried exclaiming, but all that came out was barely a wheeze. I couldn't move for what seemed like an eternity, but it had to have been just a few seconds, a minute at most. Just a little kid watching as this large black humanoid thing stood before me. When I could finally move, I bolted for my parents' room, not daring to look back, tears stinging my eyes. I charged in, catching my mom off guard, who snapped awake. "Honey, what happened?" she asked, mostly still asleep. I just looked at her. I couldn't say a thing. I didn't want to say anything. I clung on to her, but she got up and brought me back towards my room. I refused to go in until the lights were turned on. She was confused but obliged. I was put to bed and slept with the lights on for a while. Eventually, a year passed by without incident. One night I tried sleeping with my lights off again. Bad choice. A very bad choice. I was met with the same figure. Large, black, featureless. Dread set in, stripping me of my ability to move. Moments passed by. When I could finally move again, I once more darted for my parents' room, heart beating fast. Yet I was somewhat calmer than the first time. My mom responded to my panic with a delay this time, just as before they sent me back to my room. When I made it back to my doorway alone, I didn't dare to look. I reached a hand into my doorway, tentatively flicking on a light switch right in the doorway, turning on some Christmas lights that my dad had put up as an attempt to make me sleep with my main light off more. But it was gone. The thing was gone. My mom stopped by my room and sat with me a bit. As soon as she left, I turned on my main lamp. My room was at last fully illuminated. I went back to sleep. About 7 years passed without incident after that until recently. It started up again, but this time it was worse. Way worse. I was in my teens then. I began confidently sleeping with my lights off, but not without minor lighting, for about 2 years now, having no issues other than nightmares. But then the summer of 2020 rolled in. My family had used money originally intended for Disney World to buy a camper, which will be important later. One night in the beginning of the summer, after my first year of high school, I woke up from a nightmare, only to be met by more torment. It wore a mask and what seemed to be a black cloak that covered most of its body. The mask seemed to be modeled after a witch, something you might see during Halloween. But with an over-exaggerated nose, a tan color complete with warts like a stereotypical hag. No features were visible but the mask. The thing gripped me with claw-like hands, aggressively slamming me against my bed. Fury surrounded it. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak, I couldn't even see straight. I was helpless, just silently praying it would stop. It must have only been a few seconds, but every second was terrifying. I willed my eyes to shut, and it stopped suddenly. When I opened my eyes again, the thing was gone. So my lights went back on for a few nights. Another month passed by. It was now about August, if I recall correctly. My family and I went on a camping trip at Allegheny State Park to take the new camper on another test run, needing a break from home. Staying home so long had been really rough on my family, having lost both our grandfathers at the beginning of the whole mess. So we set out to enjoy some time camping in a beautiful state park that was also said to have a lot of paranormal activity, which had my mom, my sister, and I rather excited. We've always been fascinated by that stuff. The first day or two had been relaxing, peaceful. This might be important to mention, but my sister and I share a bunk bed in the camper. She has the top bunk and I have the bottom. There's a curtain hanging from the ceiling that veils the entrance for privacy and such. Next to the bunks is the door to the bathroom, and then the way to the main area of the camper, and the master bedroom, where my parents sleep, is on the other side of the camper. Anyway, it was the second night, if I recall correctly. I had gone to sleep after watching an episode of a collective favorite TV show of my family. I slept for a bit until I was awakened again. I found myself being violently shaken. The thing seemed to have tagged along with us for this trip. I knew it was the same entity, even though it now instead wore a jester mask, complete with bells, black and white. The hands were gloved, black gloves that shook me. I tried yelling for my parents or even my sister. Nothing but a rasp came out. I managed to blink at one point, and once again it stopped. The thing vanished again. I believe when I looked around the clock read 2-something a.m. I stood from my bed, skittishly exiting my nook and sitting down on one of the seats by the camper's table. My mother noticed me awake and asked, "What's up?" as she peeked out of the master bedroom. "Nothing," I mumbled. "Just a bad dream," I added, lying, but I didn't care. It wouldn't matter if I told her anyway. I climbed back into my bed, trying to fall back to sleep. I finally did. After that experience, I was safe until winter and late fall, where the experiences resumed once more. But what I don't understand is why those experiences now happen to me monthly. Once every month, since December I think, I get these 2 or 3 identical scratches on my lower torso after having these episodes. My nightmares revolve around a jester mask. It hasn't shaken me since the experience during a camping trip, but I still see it, clad in a jester outfit with ringing bells and a sinister grin. Recently, in my second most recent encounter, I didn't directly see the thing, more so just heard the ringing of the bells, once again around 2 a.m. But the jingling of the bells came from an odd location. I could hear those darn bells ringing above my head, like the thing had tried its best to get closer to me, crawling just out of the range of the cross that hangs on my wall. I didn't make a sound. I didn't move. My vision blurred out and went dark. Next thing I knew, it was gone. When I awoke in the morning, I spotted those 3 identical scratches going down my lower torso, fading off, thin and orderly, too far apart to be from my family cats. It scares me. This now brings me to my most recent experience, which was probably one of the worst of them. This was last month, January 2021. I thought the new year would bring relief, but it seems I was mistaken. Once again, my lights were off. My room illuminated by a small lamp, but that was even in the far corner of my room, casting an eerie blue glow. I was asleep on my stomach, facing my wall. I found myself unable to move, awakened by something. The orange glow from a lava lamp I got from my sister was in my sight. I heard a voice. It sounded female, quiet, and seemingly terrified. I don't know if it was one voice or many, but there was something off about it. Maybe it was the quiet, echo-like quality of it, but it just wasn't right. I swear I heard it calling for my help, demanding I wake up and face them. Help me. Help me. We're under attack. We're gonna die. This wasn't right. I was worried, deeply scared. Deep down, I knew I shouldn't move. I should try and pretend I was still sleeping. I shouldn't listen to them. There was something wrong with this on so many levels. But the voice persisted. Come on, wake up. Why are you just lying there? Help. The voice kept pressing, getting harsher. I knew whatever this voice was coming from wasn't human. I couldn't listen to it. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had listened to it. I forced myself to close my eyes, and the voices stopped. When I opened my eyes again, I looked around. There was no one there. I drifted off to sleep again, and I woke up the next morning. I once again found scratches. Call it a nightmare. Call it my imagination. Call it insanity. Whatever. I could feel those times it shook me or slammed me. It was crystal clear. Believe me or not, that's for you to decide. But if anyone knows what this is or why it's happening to me, please tell me. I just want to know how to make it stop. I've now been praying every night to try and avoid encountering this thing, but sometimes it's to no avail. I'm just glad to finally share this with someone. It's like weight off of my shoulders. If I have another experience, I can share if you want. I guess one isn't even safe in their own bed. I have a recent skinwalker encounter I'd like to get off my chest. Now, I'm not the best writer, and I've spent some time pre-writing this to ensure the details are all included. I'm going to forewarn you. It's not really that exciting, as no one died, and for that, I'm fortunate. I'm 24 years old and a biologist currently finishing up my PhD at a top Baptist university in Central Texas. I've been in the state for a few years now. However, originally, I came from up north. I've made it more than halfway through the program, and I'm finishing up my research projects in preparation to graduate with my PhD. My research focuses on mosquito-borne illnesses, and I intend to utilize my PhD and my research interests as a ticket to direct commission as a medical entomologist for the Army. A lot of my research consists of field work. This includes mosquito larvae collections. As I conduct a lot of field work, I often find myself in remote places, including state and national parks. Over the last few years, I've been collaborating with a former military medical entomologist. The reason I had this encounter was fueled by the collaboration I had with this entomologist. During our collaborative work, I've traveled to mostly every state park in Central Texas. This includes Fort Parker, which is handily located west of the Piney Woods region of Texas. The reason I mention this is that I've heard of other cryptid stories, including skinwalkers in East Texas, and Fort Parker was a few hours from Piney Woods, where another poster had encountered one. I never saw anything weird up to this point, but I believe what I saw was a skinwalker due to the sheer proximity to the Piney Woods and the short time it would take to get there. Now that day I wasn't in the Piney Woods or Fort Parker. Instead, I had traveled to Meridian State Park. Meridian is in central eastern Texas, south of Dallas, and considered the heart of Bosque County. It was around 3 hours from Fort Parker and 4 or 5 from the Piney Woods region. I was tasked with doing some mosquito larvae surveys to see what species were present, and this had become a routine activity, so I thought nothing of it. The park was eerily deserted for a Sunday morning, with a few campsites set up and a few park rangers working. I quickly signed in at the ranger station, showing my collection credentials, and was given a parking sticker receipt for my car windshield. The weather was quite good, with a temperature around 74 and partially cloudy skies. I parked my car at one of the parking lots next to the lake, specifically next to Lakeside Campground Premium Shelter 4. I had counted no more than 5 cars, and from memory remember seeing a bunch of Taiwanese tourists. I applied some bug spray. As a biologist, I've learned a lot about mosquito-borne illness, tick-borne illness, and I wouldn't be a happy camper to be on the receiving end of any pathogen. I grabbed my rucksack out of my trunk as well as my collection gear, which included my larval dipper, strainer, Eppendorf tubes, 50 milliliter conical tubes, etc. Now, I'm usually legally carrying when I go into state parks, due to being from the north originally and having to deal with predators. However, on that day, I chose not to bring my 9mm because it was so humid. My original plan was to hike the Bosque Trail and cross over onto the Shinnery Ridge Trail, sampling any streams I passed. I started out on the Civilian Conservation Corps Bridge and made my way north on the Bosque Trail. It was pretty amazing at first. The forest was alive with insect activity, bird calls, and a slight breeze which rustled the trees. The Bosque Trail at this point crosses over into the smaller Little Forest Junior Trail, which is about 0.8 miles long. I stopped at Wildflower Field as it was the first time I visited the park and I wanted to see some of the sights, but the field was mostly dead. The wildflowers had been trampled, withered, and covered in weeds. Reluctantly, I continued along the trail and saw maybe one other person the quarter mile I was on the Junior Trail. He asked what I was doing, and I briefly explained why I was carrying all that gear. We parted ways, and I eventually made it back on the Bosque Trail. After a while, I stopped at B Ledge, which is a rock formation overlooking Lake Meridian. It was an amazing spot, so I decided to take a picture. Now, as I left that ledge, the weird things began to happen. These things would continue to intensify as I went down the trail. A quarter mile from the B Ledge, I started to encounter large objects blocking the trail path. Several logs seemed to have been dragged onto the trail. Additionally, fallen trees were spread out along the next quarter-mile stretch. Crossing over them was quite difficult, and there were a lot of them. This continued for several hundred feet until the trail steeply went up the side of the mountain. It seems that at some point, the rangers had carved out stone stairs into the rock face. However, they were deteriorated, and at this point, hard to traverse. The trail had a long railing made from what looked to be outdoor power cord. The disrepair continued to intensify as I made my way deeper onto the trail. At the start, the trail markers were shiny metallic rectangles with a blue indicator nailed to trees. However, they soon transitioned into just blue spray paint on the bark. I constantly kept getting lost on the trail. Now, I'm not a person who gets lost easily. I've had a lot of hiking experience and consistently went on collections in various state parks. Upon reaching the first stream, I crouched to unpack my rucksack and started to collect larvae using the dipper. The water wasn't that deep. It wasn't flowing and had become stagnant with a deep brownish color. Using my larval dipper, I collected water and strained it for mosquito larvae. I made several collections and ultimately found several species, including Culex pipiens quinquefasciatus, a very common southern species. After taking my samples, I carefully packed my rucksack to ensure the samples wouldn't be disturbed during transit. From experience, if it's too shaky, they won't be able to float at the water's surface and breathe, ultimately leading to their death. It's much easier to identify an adult mosquito versus a larva, and I didn't want to have to identify 100 dead larvae. As I continued to venture forth, the trail started to get worse and worse. It reached a point where I became teed off, and I thought to myself, why the heck does it look this way? What are the rangers doing out here? I started to take GPS-tagged pictures, which I could pass off to the rangers for trail repair operations. At this point, I doubted that any common person, let alone a weekend hiker, would be able to successfully navigate the trail, and I thought it posed a significant safety risk. Moving onward down the trail, I reached a dense area of woods. It seemed that out of nowhere the trail entered a thick brush and stayed in it for a while. The thick brush had minimal undergrowth, but darkened the trail due to the thick canopy created by the overlapping trees. Now I am a religious person. Thinking back, I should have realized that darkness ultimately relates to evil, and should have been forewarned of continuing. Entering those dense woods seemed to have transformed everything around me, not physically, but in a sense where it felt different. The bird calls disappeared, the insects were silent, and the trees were not rustling anymore. Slightly alarmed, I continued onward. I was approximately an eighth of the way through the Bosque Trail, and had several more streams needed to be collected, which would take several hours. By then, it was 1 p.m. After a while, I felt as if I was being watched, and I started to get very anxious. I'm not a paranoid person, but I had a very strong feeling I was being watched. I usually don't get feelings like this, so when I experience them, it's usually wise to trust them. I scanned the area and didn't see anything, so I continued onward. There was still no noise, so I increased my pace so I could get out of this creepy area quickly. Then I reached a second stream and decided to sample it. Like the first, the water was dark and stagnant. I unpacked my gear and quickly worked to collect samples. I found a few varied insect larvae, including several mosquito larvae and several dragonfly larvae. I removed the dragonfly larvae as they kill mosquito larvae, and if I had left them all, the mosquitoes would have been dead before I returned to campus. As I was packing up, I started to smell a stagnant copper smell. It's hard to explain, but the best explanation is a mixture of blood, roadkill, and death. I'm having a difficult time writing this next statement, but I'll give it my best go. As a man of science, I've learned a lot about the biology of living creatures. I've been able to extract mosquito blood mills and determine the blood mill host species using mitochondrial DNA. I've gene-edited and made transgenic mosquitoes with edited receptors. I believe in a rational explanation for everything, as I've experienced a structured order to nature. At first, I freaked out a little bit internally, but had a strong belief that some armadillo decided to die near the trail and his decomposing corpse was responsible for the smell. The trail was still in a thick part of brush, so not seeing a corpse wasn't too alarming. I continued down the trail, heading toward the northern bend in the Bosque Trail, which can be seen on the trail map. Upon reaching the northern bend, I stopped for a few seconds. I still felt like I was being followed, but I couldn't smell the stagnant copper anymore. So I partially relaxed, looking at the map, then continued onward, southwestward, down the trail. After a short while, the smell returned. I was far enough from the stream that it would be very unlikely that it wafted this far. This startled and concerned me, as it isn't normal for so many corpses to be near trails, and I've never experienced something like this before. I reached a small bridge, and the thick forest started to clear out, where I could see for a short distance between the trees. I stopped for a minute to look at the map on my phone, as the trail had sort of dissipated. The bridge had a small stream running underneath it, but I reluctantly still felt awkward, so I didn't sample it. While looking for where the trail continued, I found a large black object standing in my peripheral vision about 300 feet away. My eyes adjusted to it, and the image focused into what appeared to be a person standing 6 feet tall. However, the face was wrong, and it was covered in fur, not clothing. I looked away for a second, and looked back. The object had disappeared. Inside, I was freaking out. but soon I found where the trail started back up, and the object was standing in the opposite direction when I saw it. I noped down the trail and ensured I kept my eyes scanning near where I saw that object. My biggest concern at this point was something was following me, possibly a large animal, and I'd rather not make the 6 o'clock news. While continuing down the trail, the smell still lingered, and I saw it again, still about 300 feet away. This time I noticed that it was some sort of animal. I assumed it was a deer standing on its back feet. I stopped to observe it, and I noticed it was walking on 2 feet, very awkwardly, and the fur seemed to have large missing spots. I knew it wasn't humans, as humans don't walk that way, not even if they're injured. It had a very primal, animalistic walk. I'd blinked, and at some point it disappeared. I got really spooked and almost started sprinting down the trail. I covered a mile of harsh terrain in about 5 minutes. I made it to a clearing where I could see across the lake and toward where I'd parked. At this point, I could hear something from the direction I came in. It seemed to be slowly getting louder. "Bill, where'd you go? Bill, go you?" My mind pieced together that it was saying, "Bill, where'd you go?" I have no clue who Bill is, and the voice didn't sound human. It was as if an animal's voice box was being forced to pronounce human words. It sounded raspy and primal. This scared the absolute ever-loving crap out of me. I kept a steady pace down the trail. I kept scanning my surroundings and cursing at myself for not bringing my 9mm. The smell intensified, and I'm pretty sure it was following me closely. I made due diligence to ensure I wasn't being outmaneuvered or flanked. Whatever it was hunting me, and I had around 70 pounds of gear on me. Ultimately, I was a slow-moving target. I eventually made it to the eastern campsites marked with a picnic bench on the map and felt a sigh of relief. I'm not sure if these things hunt in open terrain, but I would have a good view of it if it left the tree line. To my surprise, there was an older middle-aged lady camped out there. She had a dog with her, and the dog was going absolutely nuts barking. At first, I thought I spooked the dog, but after looking at it for a while, it was barking at something in the tree line, not me. After a while, it whimpered and ran away from the tree line and toward the lady's tent. She called out his name. Let's say it was Fido because I can't remember it exactly. I gave a distant hello wave and continued to awkwardly run down the trail carrying my gear. It was quite peaceful and quiet for a short distance down the trail, and eventually I reached a road. I felt guilty about how that lady was probably going to get eaten by whatever that was, and I felt fortunate that I escaped. About half an hour later, I stumbled out onto a Forest Service road. The trail seemed to wind onto the road and just abruptly end. Now, from my recollection, this is the road on the southwestern corner of the map, which parallels the trail. The smell began to come back, and I started to panic again. This time I could hear, "Where? Fido." This really freaked me out because whatever was saying that was mirroring what the lady had said. Now the trail didn't have a good indicator of where it started back up. I was freaking out as the noise was increasing. I started to head where I thought north was on the road, and eventually I figured out it was the wrong way as it didn't follow the contour of the road on the map. I double-timed it back, finding a park ranger's truck driving down the road towards me. I flagged him down and asked him where the Bosque Trail started back up. To my surprise, the trail actually backs onto the road, where you have to walk down the road following spray-painted dots, and eventually it goes back into the woods. I'm sure the ranger knew what was up, as he was very brief and told me to stay on the trails. I asked him if there were any predators in the woods, which I should worry about. His eyes got real big, and he told me to stay on the trails again, not to deviate, and to probably call it a day. He took off speeding down the road, and I awkwardly sprinted southward, eventually finding the trail again. The whole time in the distance, I could hear "Where trail back start." That thing was mocking me, and was stalking me while I talked to the ranger. I hauled tail down the trail, and eventually reached a clearing. This clearing being the southern bend of the trail, where it curves off east into a straight line. The area was quite open, almost reminding me of a rice field, as there were swamps on either side of the trail, and it was elevated on a grass mound 8 feet up and 10 feet wide. I continued in a sprint across the mound and reached the end of the trail where it looped to my car. When I made it to the bend, which led toward where I parked, I stopped and looked back. It was standing on the mound near the forest opening, maybe 200 feet away, just staring at me. It wasn't on two legs anymore, it was on all fours. The face honestly looked like the descriptions I've seen before of skinwalkers. It was sunken in, red dots and black eyes. It also seemed to be smirking. I booked it to my car, threw my ruck in the trunk, and literally didn't stop until I reached my campus. Now, I'm not sure if it's real. I'd packed a good meal, lots of water, and wasn't dehydrated. I'm in good mental health, or as best as I can be in a PhD program. It wasn't a deer, a bear, or anything I've seen before. Since then, I've not wanted to go in the woods or go collecting, rightfully so, without another person. I'm sorry if this was uneventful, but I really wanted to get it off my chest. That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to eeriecast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in, and that brings us to the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember to stay safe out there because this world is full of strange and terrifying things. If you like and enjoyed these stories, then hit the like button, press the notification bell, and subscribe for more spine-tingling content, and we will see you in the next story.